Yes.
All right. I think we're going to get started. So thank you all for coming out on such a beautiful day / night. And I promised to show a couple of photos that have green leaves in them as inspiration. We were doing a quick run through earlier today and we're all like, we should just leave that up. So today we're giving kind of a preliminary update on the archaeology that we did last November, a whole, 4 months ago, 5 months ago at this point. Before I do that, I want to quickly introduce my team who are down in front, Lauren, Nadia, and Sarah. Just give a good wave. If anybody, incredibly instrumental in essentially running the dig, doing the majority of the research for this. And if there's a question that I don't know the answer to, they're going to stand up and help me answer it, I hope. But I just want to make sure I give full credit where credit's due. But we have an incredible team. We were really fortunate to work at the Loring Greenough House this fall. And we're hoping to give you some of the initial results. We haven't done all of the analysis, so there's going to be more to come. But we're going to be sharing some of the big picture results of what we found, but also some of the plans for what we're going to do down the road, and share some of our fun little technology. For folks that are on Zoom, if you'd like to submit a question via the chat, I'm not going to see it during the talk, but we're going to do questions at the end, and they'll be sent or yelled at me from across the room by Gretchen here. Okay. I can't actually see that screen on my screen, so I'm going to do this. What I really wanted to start with, though, is not quite a land acknowledgement, but to talk about the history of this property going back as far as we possibly can. So the story of Jamaica Plain really starts with the Massachusetts people who've been here forever. I wanted to share a map that I was able to find online of what's considered to be historically known major native trails in Massachusetts and really New England. And the reason why I'm showing this is because it's going to come back to some of the storytelling that we're going to do a little bit later. But the real point here is that the network of travel and people in this space that we now call Massachusetts and Boston and Jamaica Plain really represents a massive group of people across a very large area who interacted with each other. And we actually found some of that evidence, we think, at the Jamaica Plain at Loring Greenough House here in Jamaica Plain. And the dots are some of the villages, in case you're wondering what those are for. All right, so just to kind of give you some context, this is a little bit blurry because it's so blown up photo of a 1843 map of Jamaica Plain. It's really Roxbury this time, showing kind of where we're located. So there's the Loring Greenough House, which at this point had been around for about 70 years. But what this map really shows is this kind of downtown area, or like kind of an urban core, really, a miniature urban core that was created at the confluences of multiple roads. We have Center Street and South Street coming together just outside of the Loring Greenough House. Both of those roads have been around since the 17th century. Anytime you have a 17th century road, especially one of those squiggly ones that go all over the place, you can pretty much assume that it started its life off as a native trail. And in this case, these roads actually kind of wind their way around the hills. And the early colonial roads that became roads that we have today were simply native trails that were slightly widened through use by carts over time that then got widened further for eventually carriages and then cars. And so the network of streetscapes in Boston is really based on a native trail network. When people make fun of Boston for quote unquote paving the cow paths in Boston, making all these kind of crazy roads, there were no cows in the 1620s to make these paths. They're paving native trails. All of those curly roads in Boston are from the native folks that built them and maintained them, or really created them through their walking. So we're going to come back to the native story. I want to kind of get us up to the present. Whenever we do an archaeological dig, we really start by doing a research phase where we basically have to tell our state archaeologist, Brana Simon, at the Mass Historical Commission, everything we can possibly find out about this property. And so we do a lot of background research on these properties, deed research. Fortunately for the Loring Greenough House, we have a lot of this already done for us, which is really convenient. But we wanted to kind of do the earlier stuff and really focus on that, because when you do an archaeological dig, you get the whole story, regardless of whether it's the one related to the house that's currently there, or the current story from today, or whatever was there prior to that. So we really have to go back till the glacier peels off of Jamaica Plain. What happens next? And so we trace that forward. In the 17th century, you have the Hughes family living on the property. We're not certain if they had a home on the property, And we're not entirely sure about where they got it from and how big of a lot it was. It's a little bit vague in the 17th century deeds, at least the early 17th century deeds. Fortunately, by the mid 17th century, we have two families that come along, the Pollys and the Walleys. They built a house, which we refer to, even when we don't need to talk about it, as the Polly-Wally house. That was purchased by the Cheever family in the 1740s, and then that house was removed from the property. It was possibly, if not definitely, the first church, or the whatever it is, the third church in Roxbury, which is the Jamaica Plain Church's parsonage. But when Loring came along, he wanted a bigger, nicer house. He moved that off the property. And it might be down the road. We're still not entirely sure, but it might be down the road. However, the Lorings built what you see today, the Loring Greenough House, at around 1760, give or take a year for building. So the property itself that you see here is at least the second house on the property. And there's some evidence in the basement from some really old bricks in a slightly odd, not configuration, but just portions of the basement feel older than the 1760s. That portions of the foundations in the basement of this house may be the Polly-Wally house's basement that was enlarged and partially reused. Fast forward to the 1775, the Lorings flee Boston because they were Tories and wealthy. And then the Greenoughs come along, purchase the property. It stays in the Greenough family until the Jamaica Plain Tuesday Club purchases it in 1924 and still manages it today. So this is what we wanted to also include in this is because we were really trying to focus on underrepresented and undertold stories of Boston, especially Jamaica Plain. And when we were doing our research, we were looking into, were any of these people enslavers and who were their enslaved people? And we were able to find several, as you can see in this thing. So the first evidence of enslaved people that we have related to the property, although not necessarily on the property, is Jack and Spencer, who was enslaved by the Cheever family. The issue with the Cheever family is that they also owned a very large house downtown, and this may have been their country home, or it may have been a rental property. We're not 100% certain that that the Cheever, I think it's Joshua, thank you. Joshua Cheever was even living in this house at all. However, Jack and Spencer were enslaved at the Cheever family. We see them popping up downtown. And if the Cheevers came out to this kind of rural estate, they would have been coming with them on the property, but not this house, the house that was before it. The Loring family, we know were enslavers. We have at least 3 people named, London, Othello, and Phyllis. Most of those names come out of records during and after the Revolution, when folks that were fleeing Boston were mentioning their enslaved people or discussing them in terms of the house that they left behind. And then the Greenough family enslaved a boy named Dick at the age of 5. And that's a little bit of a complicated story, but I'll come back to that in 1 second. All of these folks are the minimum. Usually we only see enslaved people recorded by name in probate records when someone passes away. So unless they're writing to somebody and that letter becomes public and they're mentioning their enslaved person, which is rare, we don't really find out about the enslaved people on properties until someone's dying and they're listing out their ownership, everything that they own in an inventory, and they mention their enslaved people as property, because that at the time they were chattel enslaved people, meaning they were enslaved for life and transferred as property. So that's Jack, Spencer, London, Othello, and Phyllis. And if you want to, read their names out loud later, you should go for that. Dick is a really interesting character in the story of enslavement in Boston. If you look at that date, 1785, for those of you that are familiar with the history of enslavement in Boston or Massachusetts, the Quock Walker case that actually made slavery illegal in Massachusetts, I'm using that in quotes because it wasn't, as you will hear, hard and fast, but happened in 1783. Dick was a boy born from an enslaved woman whose name was Bina. Thank you. This is why we need them here. Bina, who was enslaved in Roxbury at a nearby property. Dick was 5 years old when he was sold after the enslavement laws came into place to the Greenough family as an indentured servant. So after 1783, people were able to enslave people essentially by default, and Black and Native people, by indenturing them for a certain period of time. Now, that often would happen prior to this to pay off a debt or as a punishment, a legal punishment, and most commonly as a as kind of like an apprenticeship. So Dick is 5 and his mom's enslaved and has recently been set free, or at least that's the other issue. We don't know if he was set free or if she was set free, because after 1783, enslaved people still had to sue to be emancipated. So you weren't just, there wasn't like a day where everyone's like, you're all free. It was like 1783, you can't be enslaved legally anymore. However, you have to know that and then sue your enslaver to become free. So it becomes a really complicated, muddy time period. During that time period, Dick is purchased as an indentured servant at the age of 5 in 1785. Then a year or two later, I can't remember exactly how long, Dick was re-upped as a farming apprentice until he was 21. So essentially the Greenoughs, the way we're interpreting this is the Greenoughs are attempting to have an enslaved laborer on their property, technically within the legal boundaries of that time period. However, in practice, Dick was essentially enslaved as a 5-year-old in this household. These are not the only folks that do this, but Dick is one of the folks that we actually really have a lot of evidence about. Dick is not happy about this. He actually escapes and flees, and we have an advertisement of Dick leaving and being caught and coming back. And later census records actually show Dick on the property after, before he's 21. So he was caught and brought back, unfortunately. So that's one of the reasons why we really want to look at this property from an archaeological perspective is, okay, we have all of these families, especially the Lorings and the Greenoughs, whose name are associated with this property, really well-known families in Boston history, left a beautiful house behind, but who else is there? And what's their story? And what can we find in the ground from these folks that will help us understand more about their lives? Because other than their names, we don't have a lot of information about who they were and what their lives were like. However, when you do an archaeological dig at a site where you have enslaved people, especially if they are enslaved in a home, all the food that we're finding is made and prepared and thrown out by an enslaved person. All of the products that are brought to the house are transported by enslaved people. These folks have their hands literally on everything that we're finding in the ground and contributing stuff to the ground themselves. So if we're really careful and if we're really if we do a real deep dive into their influence on these artifacts, we could potentially find stories about them in the ground. So this dig was primarily, well, we'll talk about the goals, but one of the main goals was to find out, is this a place where we can get that story? We're not trying to blow up a huge hole in the middle of the Loring Greenough yard, although I think there's a pretty decent sized hole there. Sorry about the landscape a little bit now. I saw the grass isn't doing so hot in one spot, but our goal really was to be, is this a place where we want to explore that story more? And I'll talk a little bit more about what the complications of that, and also move beyond a slide full of text. Sorry about that, to another one full of text. Where are we? The Loring Greenough House is really important in the landscape of historic homes in Boston for a couple of reasons. One, it is a large rural estate, and two, it maintains something resembling that original landscape. It's not as big as it used to be. It used to be many, many, many acres. But the yard around the Loring Greenough House really does at least capture some of that open space vibe that it had back in the day. And the other thing that's really important about this house is that it's never moved from the spot. So it's always been there. And the landscape that you experience relative from the yard to the house is the same landscape. So our project was really focusing on the back part of the building and that red area, which is the area behind the L. If you ask an archaeologist where they want to dig on an historic site, they want to dig in the backyard, because nobody left trash, which is essentially what we're looking for, in the front yards and the side yards, especially on this property where you could see it from almost every side. The only place that you could really make a mess and leave it there is in the back part of the L, protected by the back of the house and by the L that's stuck off from the side. Admittedly, if you added all the other buildings that used to be there going backwards, there's a lot of other places kind of in the back of beyond that there also could have been a lot of stuff, but the household trash is not necessarily going to get carted to 300 feet away. It's going to go as far as it needs to go and be dumped. So if we're looking for that story of the enslaved people on the property, and we want to find the household trash to find out about enslaved domestics on the property, that's one of the best places to look. So when we got a call about the property, we're really excited about the opportunity to dig here. I think we're the second or third archaeological dig, no, third or fourth archaeological dig on the property. All previous digs have happened in the kind of north yard, which is on the left of this image, and the west yard, which is on the bottom of this image, and a little bit of the east yard, but no one had really done much digging around the L, except for a couple of places where there was a post put in for restoration of the L. So this was really kind of the untapped area, and also the most likely to have significant archaeological data. That's the house. Okay, this is the L where we're doing most of our work. So this is sticking out behind it. I don't know if everyone's familiar with the property, but essentially it's shaped like a big L, and this is the L-E-L-L sticking off the back of the building. It looks, like a carriage house because of these entryways on the bottom, but it's actually more of a woodshed with big arches on the front. The carriage house would have been another building, and it also has living space across the top on the second floor. And those two windows at the lower left that are in the archways are the windows that look into a hallway that's immediately next to the summer kitchen. So last year we were reached out to about looking at the summer kitchen's basement in order to help the Tuesday Club with plans to make that a much more usable space. And that's why we were even coming to the property in the first place. While we were there, we're like, well, no one's dug in the yard. Maybe we should dig in the yard if everyone's okay with that. And everyone said, sure, including the Landmarks Commission, the Estate Archaeologist, the Tuesday Club, and we were available. So we did a little bit more digging in the front yard or the side yard as well, since it had never been done before. But we were also really focusing technically indoors, which is really kind of odd when you're digging inside of a house. This is if you took the house and just took it off and all you had left was the basement, this is what it would look like. So on the left is the main Loring Greenough House with the chimney vaults, all of the bricked in areas, some of which is probably the Polly Wally house. And then in the L, you have a really interesting series of spaces. First, you have to the left of the red square, an unexcavated floor. They just took a building and just plopped it on top. That's the most recent part of the building. I would love to dig underneath that. Then you have the root cellar of the kitchen, which is above it, and then another unexcavated area that is essentially the ground level inside of that archway where the wood was kept. The reason why we were interested in digging this floor is when we got there, you'll see in a second, it had a dirt floor. And I was thinking, okay, well, this is kind of deep. They dug down into the original landscape. And if we're lucky, we can dig down through this floor of this kitchen and find something from the 19th century. But if we're really, really lucky, if we get down through that, maybe we'll get the bottom of 18th century something that was being created by the enslaved people who were living in this house before the L came on. So essentially the L, this big thing off to the upper right of this image, Wizard of Oz on top of an 18th century site. And then this the kitchen basement dug down into that further. And so we wanted to know, all right, somebody already dug the first 3 feet off for us. That's really convenient. Can we find anything down there? Maybe like the bottom of a privy or the bottom of a trash pit. So that's why we were really interested in that spot. We also wanted to dig in the yard space because that had never been surveyed before. And we were thinking, if the site's been dug away by the kitchen basement, maybe we'll luck out and find a more intact space in the yard next to it. So we went for broke. So this is what the kitchen looks like above. If anyone's seen in the basement of an historic home, when you have a brick chimney space, you'll have on the active floors these kind of fireplaces and cook spaces. You have a large hearth. Then you have a smaller fireplace that would have been kind of like a small oven, but also a place to, it's almost like a hibachi grill. You have like the flat surface on top with a little fire underneath it. And then on the right, you have a large area that would have been a boiler where you could heat up water to either use in the kitchen or the laundry, which is immediately next door. And then some other smaller fireplace area that would actually pump smoke down into the basement. And I'll show you what that looks like in a second. Then on the outside of the building, you have a bulkhead that goes down into the basement of the kitchen directly. And that's where we spent a good portion of the beginning of our dig, down at the bottom of that. And this is why we were there. So the call that we got was essentially that the basement is being used actively for storage, or at least it was actively being used for storage. But the height of the ceiling was so bad that you really couldn't use it well. It was just kind of dead storage space, or in this case, shovel and empty planter bucket space. The idea was that the dirt floor, being dirt, could be lowered down to a depth that would actually allow people to stand up inside that space. Makes sense to me. Now, that dirt floor could have been collecting artifacts for the past 200 years, which is why we wanted to know what else was down there. So that's why we stepped in and wanted to work there. And then underneath the hearth, that the support structure for fireplaces, historic fireplaces at least, is to build these large archways underneath the hearths. And those are essentially using the least number of bricks to support the weight of the larger hearth above it. And that also creates these really convenient storage spaces in the basement of these spaces. So on the left, you have an open space. In the middle, you have this kind of arched bay. And on the right, you have another arched bay that someone has come back in and sealed up slightly to form a door. And then beyond that, it's recorded in the plan that this space on the right is a smokehouse or a smoke chamber. And in the ceiling, you'll see there's bars of iron going across the open space. And there's a hole in the ceiling that goes directly from the fireplace above. The idea was that as a fire was being used on the top, on the first floor, the smoke, the cold smoke, would come down the tube, come into the smokehouse, and whatever you were hanging on those iron rods would then get smoked and cured, and you could use those as smoked meat. We were interested in finding out if we could find out evidence of what that would be like, or at least what they were doing in that space, to confirm the theory that this was a smoke chamber, though it really looked like one, but also to see if anything else was going on, because that space was also dirt floor. So we were going to dig down there to see if there's anything in there that we could learn more about the use of that space. And then the bonus was the privy. And I just will not bury the lead. We haven't dug this yet. That's the future. So that's what we're hoping to come back to do. There's a privy at the upper right corner of the L, the northeast corner of the L, that dates to sometime after 1811 when the L was built. So here we have again the open space in the middle, the root cellar. We have the left bay, the central bay, which is the chimney vault under the main chimney, and the smoke chamber. And we were digging the whole thing. On the plans, there's a dotted line from north to south that showed a former brick wall. I was expecting when we got to the site that we were going to be digging down upwards of 6 feet, because when I saw the word cistern, I'm thinking, okay, you got to keep water. Cisterns are like rain barrels in the ground. They're collecting water. It's somewhere on the left side of this building. So what I expected to see was a round or square pit that went down in the floor, and then rainwater would have been kind of pumped, or not pumped, but like drained into that space from outside. And that wall there would have just been some sort of block so that you could then go into a separate space to get to the cistern. And everything else would have been essentially storage and smoke chamber. So what we did was we planned on doing a grid. We set out grids so that we can kind of dig the site in a methodical way. It doesn't really matter, but we have a datum inside of there, north 0, east 0. So everything was measured to that point so that if we find anything, we can lay it in like 150 years. Someone will know exactly where we found it relative to that point. We can't dig a site twice, but since this is technically science, we want people to be able to reconstruct the way we did our quote unquote experiment by digging. And then we also set aside the fireplace entirely as feature 1. We were going to cut it in half, dig down one half of it, look at the profile to see how the layers look, record that, and then dig down the second half of it. But the rest of it, we were going to grid out, and we deliberately placed our units. You can see there's a slightly darker squares in places that would give us a lot of information in our very first test. So on the corner, we wanted to know what was the inside of that kind of walled off space like, and what do the corners look like? Because oftentimes if there's anything left in a basement that's been filled in, it's tucked into the corners. What I wanted to find was like the cache of wine bottles that said, Loring across the top of it. We also wanted to dig the squares where the wall we knew existed to see, does it continue or does it go down? Like what does it do essentially? And then dig into that chamber in the middle, because we know that that's kind of the storage space of unknown function. So we really want to know, like, what was that there for? So this is what it looked like after everything got cleared out. There's a pile of brick under the chimney vault, and then just kind of loose dirt. Each of those flags, it's hard to see, but they're marking the corner of a grid point on that meter grid. And then we started to excavate in those dark squares. And then we had a bit of a surprise. On the first day, I wasn't even down here digging. I was upstairs and we got a call. I think, Lauren, you were down there, right, on the first day. You come up there and like, this brick. I'm like, what do you mean? So I go downstairs and sure enough, they had come down in the very first unit on the first day to a brick floor. And so we're like, well, this is supposed to be a cistern. So now I'm starting to think, okay, so somewhere in this brick floor, we'll have our pit that drops out for the cistern, right? So we keep digging and digging. And this is the closest place to the stairs going up. But what you're seeing is the broken off wall that goes across. And you'll see that the wall continues in the floor straight across the open space with brick on one side. And on the other side, it's almost like they took the brick and then smeared it with concrete to make it be flatter or smoother, really. Underneath the brick chamber, the one that's underneath the hearth, is a thicker deposit of dirt, but essentially the same kind of 10 inches of soil, mostly sand, with a mat that was on top of it that had been completely obliterated. And then a bunch of mortar from all those bricks that had been piled on top that kind of settled down on top of it. But really consistently across the whole space, we had about 8 to 10 inches of sand, a bunch of stuff from the 19th and 20th century in it, which is really interesting. We were finding, wrappers from candy bars from the 20th century, but also ceramics from the ceramics from the mid 19th century mixed in. So this was clearly sand that had been kicking around for a long time, but the brick floor made us scratch our heads. In the end, we took a 3D scan of the property. And I think this is it's such a small space. This is really the only way to get an idea of what it's actually looks like when it's excavated. So now the top part of the image, you can see that it's been the brick has been completely covered over with some sort of concrete to make it smooth. The rest of the space is a brick floor completely across all parts of the basement, except for the chamber where the smokehouse was, which has a higher wall in the front of it. So we hadn't dug that yet when we did the scan. But you can see from this image that the goal being that they wanted to lower the floor so they could have a usable space. They were going to, after we were done with our dig, come back, dig the rest of the floor down, put a nice floor down at the bottom of it, and make it a usable space. Our pit went down about a foot, gave them tons of headspace, and we'll go forward. There we go. Tons of headspace and gave them a floor all in one shebang. So we really kind of were happy at the end of that like the project was done essentially. They didn't even have to go forward from there because they had their nice floor and the lowered floor and finished floor. But we had a bunch of questions like, why the heck is this floor here? And where's the cistern? So one of the first questions that we had was, how old is the space underneath the kitchen? If we know the L's 1811, and we know the foundations were probably built in 1811 as well, that space was created beyond that original foundation. So what's the dates for kind of all of the designation of space underneath that basement? So in the bottom of this photo, you can't quite see it, but there's a little dot in between our north arrow and the computer. For those online, you can see it in between the label and the north arrow. That dot ended up holding a lot of clues. So if you zoom up on it, on the left, there's a tiny piece of ceramic that somebody managed to break and stick in the concrete when it was still wet. We owe them a lot. That piece of ceramic, Sarah over there was able to find the exact pattern that matched it, which is the Priory pattern from John Alcock. And we know that pattern was only made from 1853 to 1861. So unless that sherd is a time traveler, there is no possible way for that sherd to have ended up in that concrete prior to 1853. So that opens a whole new series of questions. We have a basement that was built in 1811, and the floor, at least that concrete cap, came in almost 40 years or just over 40 years later, at least. Why? And why are they leaving dishes in it as well, which is a big question. We'll come back to that. So then we moved on to the smoke chamber. And one of the remarkable things about the smoke chamber is that it didn't really have that same floor that we saw everywhere else. But as we came down about 8 inches, we landed on a gorgeous pile of artifacts. And I'll show you a detail of it, but I want to show you the rendering of it first in 3D, just so you have a better idea of kind of how that chamber looked. So you can just make out, actually, it's really hard to see, but there's a shadow cast by the iron spike at the top. Well, that was fast. The back of it is the actual foundations of the building itself. And the brick is part of the vault underneath the fireplace. And you can see at the bottom, the pile of ceramics. Up close, it looks like this. This was a very fun day. So first of all, these are quintessentially mid-19th century ceramics. Before we even dated them, is like the yellowware that you see, which is yellow. We're very creative namers of ceramics. The yellowware, the whiteware, you can guess why. With the transfer print, these are all priory pattern. So there's a matched set of dishes in the priory pattern. There's a pile of these dishes in the smoke chamber, and there's a piece of one of these exact same dishes like crammed down into the concrete that would have been there about 160 years ago. But then the question becomes, why are these dishes piled up in a smoke chamber? They're clearly not smoking, you know, whatever they had on their dinner plates. The mug, the plate are all part of a match set. It's pretty rare to have match sets, but again, these folks are not poor by any means. Sarah, when she was washing, gave us this gorgeous photo of half of the artifacts that came out of that smoke chamber. So there's a lot of stuff. So we just finished washing last week, this week?
Yeah,
last week. So we're just getting to the part where we can start inventorying everything and kind of literally piecing it all back together. But there's that priory pattern dishes on the left that matches the piece that we found. But you can see there's a lot of undecorated ceramics as well. Lots of animal bones. We're going to get a lot of information about what they were eating in the mid-19th century. A lot of iron artifacts, a lot of redwares, which you only really see associated with like production or prepping of food. None of this dates to the time period that there was enslaved people, though. Maybe Dick, if he was really old and didn't move on, but I think he would have if I were him. So this is the 1850s. At this time, they had domestic servants in the house, but they were predominantly folks from the neighborhood that are coming in. Oftentimes, I don't know if we did the exact folks that were here, I can't remember, but most of the people that were doing it, that were servants after slavery ended in the 19th century were Irish folks that came to Canada and then came down to Boston. And that's what you see on most of these houses. So we're going to be trying to figure out, based on the age of these, who's the person prepping the food in the Loring house at this time. And that's a little bit of a close-up view of that same pattern of dish. All right, so now we're going to move upstairs. But before I do that, I want to finish kind of why these are in the basement. That hole upstairs or in the roof of the smoke chamber is perfectly aligned with this pile of ceramics at the bottom. It's not a huge mystery. What we think happened was after the smoke chamber became unused, and I actually think that these ceramics are going to tell us approximately when they stopped using the smoke chamber, because there's no like char on top of it. There's no blackening of anything. So they're not using the smoke chamber actively while these are in there, but they all date from the same time period. Somebody must have been cleaning up or had a whole bunch of things that they wanted to get rid of in the kitchen, and they opened up that little fireplace door and they dumped them and they went straight down into the basement like a clothing chute. And that's where they all ended up. And maybe those were piled up over a period of a couple of years. We're not going to be able to see the difference between a week and a year in the stuff that's piled up in there. Maybe one of the people that was cleaning the space, that was their secret place to dump everything. And they all turned up down there. But what we aren't seeing is, what we're only seeing is stuff associated with the prep and serving of food. So I think that this was stuff that was in the kitchen being used, prepared, possibly getting ready to serve on, that was then being brought elsewhere, that broke, and then they tossed it down the little chute. And it ended up in the basement where nobody's going to see it until some crazy archaeologists and a bunch of volunteers showed up and dug in the hole. There's also a gorgeous piece of Japanese porcelain in the middle here, or Chinese porcelain.
It might be Japanese.
Okay, that could actually be a lot younger. Yeah. Okay. The Japanese didn't start really trading outside of Japan until the 1880s. So when you see Japanese ceramics turn up on a site, it kicks things to like the end of the Victorian period rather than the early part. So these could be, we're going to look at this entire assemblage of artifacts. The youngest thing in all of it becomes the date for the whole thing. Because again, the things don't time travel. So we can see that most of the stuff in the collection is from the 1840s or 1850s and 60s. But if there's something from the 1880s, the whole thing was dumped there in 1880s. Because I don't know about you, but I definitely have things in my house that are more than like a year old. And so things kick around for a little while before they get broken and tossed. So we often have it's called a manufactured deposition lag, because archaeologists make up fancy words for everything. Okay, so then we're going to move outside. There's Sarah, surviving the cold, and amazing volunteers. I think a few of whom are here right now. Thank you for coming. Working in the back part. So we did that same grid system that we created in the basement out into the yard. And you can see we didn't do a lot of testing. We only dug 6 units. Yeah, you can see all 6. There's one right over here. The yellow squares mark where we were digging. And the goals really were to get a basic idea of what's the least we can possibly dig to find out something about the site. The problem is that every time you dig a hole, you completely destroy everything you dig through. You can never dig that hole twice. So whenever you're doing an archaeological dig, you're really balancing the destruction of the site with the learning about the site. Because if you go in and dig the whole thing up and you don't do it well, it's gone. And we have lots of amazing archaeological sites that were dug in the 60s and the 70s and essentially destroyed by the well-meaning archaeologists that had no idea what they were doing. But we're trying to do as minimal as possible to leave some of the site there, essentially, so that somebody who's thinking that we're idiots in 50 years will be able to do a much better version of this. But this is a baseline survey that just asks the question, what's here, since we've never dug in that spot. So let's find out. Just a little action shot from the dig. I wasn't quite sure how to pepper them all in. Another action shot, there's Lauren down in the hole being visited by her landlord. So the pits that we were digging, we were only leaving a couple open at a time, mostly for safety reasons, because sometimes we have to leave these open over the weekend and, you know, there's a lot of visitors. But they were spaced out as far as possible so that we can get some consistency. So I'm going to start back with the oldest stuff that we found and work kind of forward. One of the really cool things that turned up on the site, although it was a little bit annoying for the archaeologists, was that about 3 feet down, the site started over completely from scratch. So the surface that you're standing on when you're standing next to the L was put there sometime in the 1800s. It was added, the feet of, or maybe late 1700s, but a lot of it was built up relatively recently, which is good for the site underneath it, because that means that anything that's happened on this property, planting trees, you know, anything, a tree falling over even, all of that happening in the first 3 feet is leaving the older stuff completely intact. So what you see down at the midpoint is that dark band of soil. That's the original Roxbury Jamaica Plain dirt that has never been touched, never been developed, never been plowed, which I think is really cool. Once we hit that, we immediately started finding 17th century artifacts. And then when we got below that dark layer into the reddish soil that's just underneath it, we started finding native creations from the Massachusetts people below that. So what that means is that we have an intact ancient landscape at the Loring Greenough House that contains an intact native archaeological site, which is a big deal because we don't have a lot of those in Boston, especially in developed areas. Above that, what it appears to be that we're seeing is a early 19th century landscape that was created to address any of the concerns that happened from the building of the 1811 L on the back of the house. So when that house was first built, they didn't really care about the landscape, slopes, whatever that was happening behind the house. But when the 1811 L got extended off the back of the house, suddenly hills and little variations became a big deal. So they brought in a lot of dirt essentially to level the ground up to the front entrances of all the different spaces in the L. And when they did that, they brought in that feet of fill on top of it. So what was in the stuff below it though? So I want to start there. So this is a handful of native creations that we have. We do a lot of work with our Massachusetts friends, Massachusetts tribe, which are the holders of Boston, and the traditional, Boston is part of the traditional homelands of the Massachusetts. What you're seeing is 6 flakes of stone, and then one relatively large for this area, believe it or not, piece of native pottery. The rocks tell us a lot actually from this one, and it has to do with the roads. That upper piece of that kind of pink and purple coloring, that is a type of rock that we call Mattapan banded rhyolite. That only comes from one place in the entire world, which is a undeveloped parcel just east of Mattapan Square called the Babson-Cookson Tract. That rock was mined from there, carried to the site in Jamaica Plain and left there after being partially worked by a native person who probably looked at the rock and was like, I'm not gonna be able to make anything out of this, I'm done. These smaller flakes that you see below it, those aren't as useful as something as large as the Mattapan piece, but the smaller flakes are basically, you can think of them as almost like the sawdust that comes off when you're making something out of wood. They're just the pieces that break off while you're shaping the stone tool. Those are all quartzite. Now, quartzite is not from here. There's a huge amount of quartzite in like Westboro. It's actually called the Westboro Formation. It's basically central Massachusetts. And there's also quite a bit in Rhode Island. I don't know why it's here, but I have an idea. But I'll jump down to the pottery. The pottery is a small piece. It's not decorated. When we date pottery, we date it by how it's decorated. So in this case, it's a blank slate of pottery, a blank piece of pottery. However, pottery was not invented or created or used in this region, depending on how it worked out. We don't really know, until about 3,000 years ago. So the mere presence of native pottery means that this site is sometime after 3,000 years. We can go back 12,000 years, so we can kind of cross off the first 9,000 years of native history here and say, at least in this spot is a 3,000 or less year old site. And they transitioned from native pottery to historic or European ceramics around 400 years ago. So the site is currently bookended between 3,000 and 400. Unfortunately, we can't date the rocks. Those could be 12,000 years old, but it's like trying to figure out what type of who was the maker of a piece of furniture based on the sawdust. You just can't tell. You just know that they were doing something. They were making a stone tool. We could definitely date the stone tool they were making, but they didn't leave the stone tool behind for probably obvious reasons. They wanted to actually use it. With the quartzite, though, okay, with the quartzite, what we think is happening, the roads that lead into this space are coming from Providence, and they're also vaguely going towards Dedham. So the trails that lead to this one spot, the confluence of two trails, South Street and Center Street, you could get to the western part of the central part of the state on foot fairly easily. That's Nipmuc territory. Nipmucs were in control of the land that produced the quartzite. The Massachusetts here in Boston had all the rhyolites. It's really strange to see a lot of quartzite in the middle of Boston, because Boston is like the IKEA of rhyolite. Like, there's just no reason to be walking way down the street for something so easy to get at such a cheap amount, because it's right there. So one of the ideas that we have is that, similar to in the 17th and 18th century, you have taverns located at roads at intersections. So people who are traveling can pause there and rest. This is the confluence of two significant native trails. Possibly this was a place where people traveling from the west would pause before going into Boston or Shawmut or Toton, depending on what part you're talking about. And it's possible that we have Nipmuc people who are coming to Boston for whatever reason, and they're bringing with them tools made out of their local homeland rock, working on them a little bit to sharpen them or reshape them, and then either continuing on to Boston or heading back home. We don't really know. That's just a theory, though. But it does explain why there is a quartzite, and also why there's a site in this one particular spot. It's not a huge site. It's not a ceremonial site that we can tell so far, but the presence of pottery shows a stability. You're not running up and down the road with your ceramic pot, especially ones from this time period, because they're really fragile. So there's definitely like a pause point that's happening there, which makes sense for the kind of confluence, like a tavern site. All right, moving on to other parts of the property. I'm going to zoom into just the gridded spot next. So just wanted to kind of start here so you can kind of see where we're going next. All right, this is where things start getting a little weird. We did those 6 excavations and we just kept hitting utilities. Now, we called dig safe. They marked nothing. We go in and it's like a spaghetti of pipes, especially as we got closer to the house, which, I mean, admittedly, okay, yeah, we should have seen that coming. But we thought the main water line was actually further west or closer to the house. So that really wide band of red that you can see in the image, that coming out of the corner by the crawl space label, that's the water line that's coming into the town, into the back of the house from the street. It comes all the way down the driveway, hooks around like a big candy cane, and goes into the back of the house. This house is remarkable because of how dang long it took for this house to get running water. They didn't get running water until the 20th century. So the Lorings were just like, I'm good. I've been here forever. We can wait. In fact, we think the privy, which is just off to the right, which you can't quite see, would have been active in the early 1900s, because that's how long it took them to get running water, because they didn't have a bathroom up until that point. Anyway, so unfortunately, the pipe for that water line came in and kind of wrecked 2 of our units completely. Then we have a lot of other water lines. There's a really thin one coming from the crawl space down to the southeast. We think that's a water line going out to the tennis courts. that are out there, or possibly the house or the outbuilding that was out there, which is the barn. Then we have a couple of other lines coming out from where the kitchen is. One's a modern day downspout, which is PVC. Could guess that one's fairly modern. And then there's a brick drain coming out of the cellar that could actually be old enough to predate the cellar. So again, another Wizard of Ozing where the site kind of lands on top of an historic site. Then we have the thing going on in the bottom right corner. We didn't dig anywhere in this area. I wish we had. We might be able to do that later. What we found in this one unit, I'll show you a better picture of it, is the corner. It's round. The corner of a gigantic cistern with a brick top dome. So think almost like a still. You get that kind of curved top and then a round base with a really strange concrete or like some very, very bad form of concrete pipe coming out of it. And I'll show you what that looks like. But first I'll show you this. So this is the bottom of the unit that has the drain that comes out of the cistern, and you can just see the edge of the cistern. So there's the drain down at the bottom, and then as it comes around the bend, you can see we just nicked it. The edge of the brick kind of dome top drain coming out of our cistern on the top of it. Unfortunately, because of all these excavations, we were the most recent person to dig here. Prior to that, someone dug the trench for that pipe. So we had this really strange looking layers as we came down. We couldn't figure out what was going on because it looked like there was a bunch of different shapes. And then we realized that it was just a normal yard site with a big hole down the middle of it. So it did disturb quite a bit of the site, but now we have a really interesting feature that we can explore more of. So on the left is one of the jackpots of pipes that we got. You can see the PVC drain pipe with the holes underneath it so the water could drain out of it. Then below it, we have a brick drain that we just caught the corner of. And then below that is the 10-inch water main that comes out of the back of this house. Now, most houses don't have a 10-inch pipe coming out of the back one, but Loring Greenough House does. On the right, we have that pseudo concrete pipe that's coming out. It looks like wood. We thought it was wood. We broke off a piece of it and it's actually like embedded with sand and rock. So it's not wood. We're not really quite sure what it is, but I think it's a rudimentary concrete that has just not held up really well coming straight out of the brick. We were able to slide a ruler down into the brick and we were able to see that it's filled with dirt now. The cistern's completely filled up. But we were able to get the ruler far enough in that we are inside of the cistern a little bit. So we know that it's a hollow space that was later filled up. And that means that it's probably an 8 to 10 foot wide cistern or thereabouts, maybe 6 feet, but a little bit bigger than that. We're talking about 10 to 20,000 gallons of water that would be able to be stored down in there. It's a really big thing. So there's that gigantic cistern in the yard. What I want to know is there pipes leading to that from elsewhere? And where does this pipe go? Because it's not leading towards it. The hill goes in this direction. You really can't get the pipe to drain towards the cistern. So this cistern's collecting water. And then I think that the pipe essentially is an overflow. And when the water comes up to that level, it drains out automatically. And I just realized I didn't talk about the cistern in the kitchen. We'll talk about that towards the end then. We're getting late though. Okay, but so I'll talk about right now. So the cistern in the upper part, on the left part, what we realized was that concrete that we're talking about the cistern in the kitchen real fast. The concrete that we found that had that piece of sherd embedded in it was essentially a waterproofing of that room. So when you walk down into that basement, that wall that's no longer there held back about 6 feet of water that was filling about, what is it, like a 20 by 6 foot area or 15 by 6 foot area. So like a swimming pool essentially underneath the kitchen. There's a water line that's about a foot below the current floorboards of the kitchen that once we realized what it was, we could see really distinctly, like, oh yeah, there's the high water mark. And then we saw really subtly 2 holes at the water line that were lead pipes that would have been the overflow pipes so that when the cistern got above that point, rather than flooding the kitchen, it would then drain out into the yard. So they had a enormous cistern in the basement of the kitchen that if you like poke through the floor, go down a foot, you'd be in 6 feet of water. That probably also would have done really cool things for the heat in the kitchen because it would have been a gigantic reservoir of heat during the winter and cool during the summer. So it may have actually done a couple of purposes. It also would have been a great source of moisture and mold, but we're not really sure how that all worked. I want to know, or I think one of the questions that we have now is, okay, so we have a cistern here and a cistern there. They're monsters. Why do you have 2 of them? Did this replace that? or did that replace this? So what we're going to be doing is carefully looking at the trench that they dug for this pipe and the artifacts in that to say, are those artifacts, when they backfilled that trench, are we getting stuff from before 1853? Because that would mean that this trench was dug for that cistern before the concrete went into the well as a cistern in the basement, and then we can start kind of doing an order of operations out in the property. So it may be that they wanted to duplicate the cistern inside of the L in a much more controllable space than essentially a hole in the ground with bricks in it. So that's a question that we don't really have an answer for yet. There also could have been a pump on the top of the cistern, so people could have gotten to their water. It's not a well. You don't need a dome on the top of a well. Wells are just straight down. So there's probably also, well, actually, no, you know there's a well. There's a well on the north side of the property. So this would have been gray water that was collected for other purposes than drinking. Okay, what else did we find? Lots of rocks. There is some bizarre pavement that's happening across the site. It's not in that 17th century deposit. It's actually on top of the fill that's on top of it. So we think it's related to the L, the addition on the back. The issue though is that we have to get a lot more resolution from the dates of the artifacts. So we're going to be able to date the artifacts in the bricks and in the rocks. We're going to be able to date the artifacts from just underneath the rocks, and we're going to be able to date the artifacts on top of the rocks. And that should tell us when was the land open before the rocks came in, when did the rocks came in, and when were they filled on top, because they're about a foot down now. But they have very distinct edges. Like there's no mystery there, like that's an edge and there's an edge there. When we look at I'll show a video of what they look like in 3D, because we have the technology and why not show it off. The question that we're having now is, what are we seeing? Are we seeing the edge of a thing that then had stones up against it? Or are we seeing the edge of a paved area that then had something else next to it? We don't really know, but it's a flat level area. They're carefully laid. They're not quite smooth enough to be like a cobblestone road, but they are smooth enough to be considered a cobblestone pavement. So I wouldn't want to run a horse and buggy over this at like 20 miles an hour, but it would be a really good solution if you wanted to be able to slowly move something across the landscape without a mud fest, which we know is about, well, it's happening now and for the next month. That's why you put a cobblestone pavement in your yard space. But we have some evidence that there may be a building on the property that we don't have any previous evidence for. So here's the cobble pavement that you just saw. That is located right here. So one of the things that we start to notice is a cobble pavement in the everywhere that's black, essentially. So there's a cobble pavement here. There's a somewhat angular one here, and there's a truncated one that unfortunately that water line went right through the middle of, but we saw the edges of it. That's not a lot of data to go by because there's a lot of missing parts of this, but what I'm starting to see is 3 edges somewhere, because there wasn't one here, so somewhere over there. And then in one of our trenches, it's a little bit hard to see, so I included a drawing of it. We dig down deep enough that we can start to see what's going on underneath these deposits. So you can see the cobblestone pavement on the left. We destroyed it by digging it. This is why we don't like to dig when we don't have to. So we destroyed the cobblestone in that area to get underneath it. And on the right, we drew a profile of what that deposit looks like. So I'm glad I put this in there because it's almost invisible. There's a cut that comes down from the edges of the rock and then swoops to the side. So on the left side, we have at this 10YR 3/2 very dark gray brown, that's our code for its brown dirt. That's the buried A, which is the original 17th century landscape. Then we have our B, which is the red dirt that usually has native stuff in it. And then we have our C, which is the glacial stuff that no one's ever seen. Literally no one has ever seen. And then above it is fill. But then somebody came along and cut through all of that and did something. We don't know what. So what we're going to be doing with our analysis is dating this feature to figure out when did this happen. We're going to be really carefully looking at what's cutting through what on the wall, because is it cutting through the rock or is the rock on top of it? That's a big question. This looks just like the foundations of a basement, or at least a pit underneath a basement. When you're digging a trash pit, you tend to dig a bowl shape because you're not really worried about straight sides because you're going to just throw trash in it. When you're digging something that you actually want to put something into, you want to have straight walls. So this has a very straight wall on the side of it. If we were in a graveyard, I'd be like, it's a grave shaft. It's not. This is 19th century. Nobody was buried in this property in the 19th century. What this looks like is what we call a subfloor pit or a basement that's underneath or was where there was a structure, possibly. There could be other things, but that's what we're leaning towards right now. So if you use, this is the only one that we actually have that nice scoop next to. So this appears to be something going in this direction. If we had more testing, we would like to see if they continue around the bend from this one. And if it continues out that way, the building could be fairly large. It may not be a building. Maybe they put in a swimming pool and then dug it all back up. I don't know. But there's an edge there that has a basement to it. And that's now one of our questions. If we had, if we could go out and reach out to UMass Boston and have them do their geophysical, their ground penetrating radar, we could run that over the property and they should be able to actually see the edges of that cobblestone. So that's one of the things that we have in our back pocket about answering that question without digging more. And I'll talk about why we may not want to dig more. Artifacts. We don't stop at the end of the interesting period. We go right up to today and collect everything. So we have a Hello Kitty toy. We have a lot of buttons. We're really just getting going on the artifacts. So I'm not going to talk too much about it today, but what we are seeing is a lot of personal adornment, which is stuff that you're actually wearing on your body. We want to know, is this the Lorings? Is this the greenhouse? Is this the Cheevers? Is it the Polly Wally farm? Or is it the enslaved people? We have a really nice shirt button on the upper part. It's carved mother of pearl. We have a glass button. It's very fancy, though it doesn't look it there. And we have what's essentially an underwear button, these kind of bone buttons that would be on kind of like a white underclothes. You wouldn't necessarily even see that button. And then Hello Kitty, which is not 19th century. We also have a ton of bone and a ton of food. So right up against the house, it didn't photograph really well. This is the best photograph we really have of it. There's another pit right up against the kitchen that we're really struggling on getting a date from, but we're gonna be able to really get a targeted, really tight date once we get through all the artifacts, which are just getting washed. But at the bottom of it is a pile of oyster shell, which you can see all around the edges. These kind of white things are complete intact oysters, are intact. They've been eaten, but they're intact shells. Half of a cow pelvis in the bottom of it, some rocks and a ton of other bone. So this is just a feast that got dumped in the ground after it was done right outside of the kitchen. So one of the things that we were really hoping to find in this property was trash pits from the 18th and 19th century. This is definitely a 19th century trash pit. Has nothing to do with enslaved people, unless maybe it was Dick's or Dick associated with Dick. But we're going to be able to date the artifacts really tightly to figure that out. There's a couple of artifacts on this site that are really going to be time markers for us. There's a ceramic called the pearlware. It's a white ceramic with a slight blue tinge. It didn't come to America until after 1775. So if we find pearlware, we're in the Greenough territory. If we find no evidence of pearlware, we might be in the Lorings or earlier. Creamware, which is a little bit before that, comes around in 1762. If we find creamware, we're in the Lorings. If we find creamware and no pearlware, we're only in the Lorings. If we find creamware and pearlware, we're in the Lorings and maybe the greenhouse. So like there's really nice dates that are going to stack up on this site that we can use for just getting references for time. I'm way over time. So what's happening now? Sarah's been washing like crazy. So this is all the artifacts from one bag from the just actually the ceramics in the glass from one bag of the artifacts from the smoke chamber. Again, this is that priory pattern, which you already saw all washed out lovelyly. We're going to come back though. So this isn't over. We have the privy still to dig. It's intact that we can tell. It's filled with dirt. That's good. It may have been used in the 20th century, so I'm not really excited about that part, but we know from the way the house was built or the L was built that the privy is blocking part of a window. So it would have been built after 1811 when the actual L was built. There's pretty strong evidence of a massive ceramic dump near it from earlier stuff that happened on the property. So there could actually be another privy nearby. So we're going to be surveying next to the privy and in the privy. It's entirely possible that there's a really important older deposit that had nothing to do with the building at all, because this area of the building where the kind of the shed portion is on dirt floor. It has no basement. So if you're in the 18th century part of the site, the stuff that's happening there had no knowledge of the fact that it would be underneath this building at one point. So there's two different stories being told between the pre-1811 and the post-1811. So one of our jobs is going to be kind of tweezing them apart and say, okay, this is they had no idea this was going to be an L. This is the L deposits, even though they're in the same spot. That's Nadia and I were on the last few days of the dig, very carefully prying up the floor of the privy. We're going to be in the privy because it's still a privy, going through the floor and digging in the tiny little space that we can get into to see what's down there. And that's what the future holds for us. There's another challenge of this property. So when we're finding native creations, and the native communities ask us to refer to them as creations instead of artifacts, because it keeps the humanity connected to the stuff, because they were created by someone or made by someone. The native community kind of flagged this when we brought it up to them. It's like, I called them from the site, like we're finding flakes, we're finding pottery. It's at the confluence of two roads. And they were like, well, what's happening here? Like, what's going to happen to this property? I'm like, well, they're not developing it. There's not going to be a condo anytime soon. The only thing that was really planned was a lowering of that basement deposit in the sandy area, and that's done. It's completely done. The rest of it is really just us asking the question, what's there? And so we got pushback from the native community, which was basically, if you don't have to disturb the site any further, please don't. So we got an agreement from them to finish the dig, and technically we're not done yet. So we wanted to do like that series of pits. So we talked to them about what we were going to dig. We also talked about like what kinds of things we would find that would be an automatic stop to the dig. And then we have an agreement that we will go to that point and then stop and then go back to the native community and say, here's what we found. What should we do next, if anything? The problem, though, is that if we're finding evidence of the enslaved people on the site, we also want to go to the descendant community in Boston and say, we have this, what do we do next? If we're lucky, both folks will say the same thing, but if they don't, we're going to have to figure out what to do. So that's what the future holds for us as a community archaeology program. If the native community doesn't want the site to be disturbed, then ethically, we shouldn't dig anymore. And fortunately, the site's not being disturbed down the road, and we know the site's there. So all we have to say is there's a really cool site there, and let's leave it there. That's the best thing you can do for it. But if we want to ask questions about it, one of the only ways we're going to be able to do is to dig it. And we can't go down to the historic stuff and then stop at the native stuff. The phrase is you don't dig half a hole in archaeology. You start a hole, you go till the time period, till humanity stops, which means we'd have to dig through the native stuff. So it may just come down to the point that we're going to agree that there may be areas of the site that we set aside to say this is not going to be disturbed because of the concerns of the native community. There may be other areas that is like, we were going to dig this because it doesn't appear to have an intact native site, but it could have the slave site. So we want to make sure we do that. But that's what's next for us is to kind of go through that process of finding out what is the right answer to that. Is there a right answer? And how do we kind of juggle two different opinions if they disagree with each other? And it's not gonna be like an angry disagreement, but like some people may want us to dig and some people may not want us to dig. What do we do in that situation? But that's what community archaeology is that the archaeologists are the technicians, the community decides what's best for the site. Unfortunately, with folks like the Tuesday Club, we really don't have to worry about a developer coming along or someone not getting the fact that this is an important site. This has been hand in hand with the owners of the property this entire time, cheering us on and really getting why this matters, especially today, when this site really holds potentially the stories of at least 5 or 6 enslaved people. I'm going to stop there because I'm over time and I really want to hear any of your questions that you might have, but thank you. That's fine. I can see everybody. Any questions? Yeah.
You mentioned that there's imaging technology that they have at UMass. So do some archaeological digs start with that so that they don't just randomly dig?
Yeah, so the question for the folks online was with imaging processing, with imaging of sites before you dig possible, do some people start with the imaging before you dig the site? Yes, definitely. The issue here is a timeline. If we work with UMass Boston, we're asking them to do it pro bono. And so if they're busy, we're not going to get the results for quite a while. The other challenge with there's a whole bunch of different things. It's called remote sensing. It's basically just like figuring it out from someplace else, even if it's just a couple feet above. But things like ground penetrating radar, electronic resistivity, geomagnetism, there's a whole bunch of things we could do. The challenge is that get maps. So you see in the movie Jurassic Park, they bring out, they're digging at the beginning and they bring out that machine and it goes boom, and a perfect image of a velociraptor shows up. It's nothing like that. So you bring the machine out, you drag it all over the place, you pull it up on a photo and you just get fuzz. And it's really, really useful if you have some information first. So what it's awesome at is finding electronic lines. Those show up like 4th of July, and you can know I'm gonna not dig there. But oftentimes you're like, okay, there's a smudge, a line, a fuzzy thing, a blob, and another smudge. Now let's go test those things. And it's targeting those features, and sometimes they're nothing. So in this case, we felt it was faster and easier to do a very wide space survey to get a baseline of what's there. So now if we did the radar or whatever, we would know that about 2 feet down, there's a stone pavement. We see it here, here, and here. What does that look like in the radar? How far does it go? Now that we know that that's what is stone, like what's there, we can extrapolate the results out to the whole area and say that is a stone pavement, not a blob. Ditto for the pipes and for the cistern. Another challenge that we have in Boston is our clay that the bricks are made out of is very similar to our dirt. And so what a lot of these machines are really figuring out is the relative difference in water levels or water contents of the soil. So we've had instances where we've done radar and there's a brick foundation of a whole building made of brick. It doesn't see it because it just sees it as dirt. So the stone pavement will show up really well, but that brick cistern may not show up. What may show up is the dirt inside the brick cistern, which has a totally different amount of moisture in it than the brick itself, hopefully. So now that we have like 10 pieces of data, now if we did the radar survey or whatever, we'd be able to really be able to connect the dots on what everything is and be able to basically recreate the landscape without digging. But that just tells us what's there, not okay, so there's a hole there and a pavement, but that doesn't really mean anything unless we actually found artifacts associated with all those things. So it still doesn't replace the digging, but it does give us a better idea about where things are, and we can maybe be more targeted at that point and not chasing blobs from the beginning. So it really comes down to, do you have time to get these results before you start? And then would it be helpful to have some data before you go for the radar survey? So in this case, I think I would love to do the radar thing. And now that we have some data, it'll really support the interpretation of what the radar results would be. Because they did the radar survey for the entire North Yard already. UMass did that a couple of years ago. So we have that, but no one's done it to the South Yard where we were. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
In terms of the native creations you found, how would you compare that to other sites you've excavated in the greater Boston area?
Sure. They are similar but different. So in places like the first church in Roxbury, which was a hill, we found a lot of flakes, but they were really local. We didn't find, there's some from other places, but they were predominantly local stones. This is predominantly exotic rocks that are being brought in. So that's telling us something a little bit different happening here. The hill site in Roxbury where the church is probably more ceremonial and significant culturally than the crossroads of two roads, because this is probably more of a pragmatic site where things are just kind of paused and living is happening. The fact that there's any stone tools being made means that it's not so ceremonial that they're keeping it really clean. And the fact that there's pottery there means that there's a pretty significant pause happening in that spot. It's one of the few sites that we have that has pottery, because it just doesn't survive in the ground really well. It really absorbs a lot of water, and when the frost hits it, it just literally explodes and turns back into mud. So the fact that the preservation is good enough that we can see the pottery is really exciting, and it also gives us a good date. There's not a ton of creations compared to some other sites, and the other thing that we are not seeing is shell, which would be indicative of a coastal site, which we are technically coastal here, but most of the shell sites are right on the coast. So a lot of our native sites in Boston, because the preservation is really good, is out on the Harbor Islands, because that landscape is relatively intact. And those are predominantly shell middens, we call them. So they look very different from this site because it's predominantly clamshell with artifacts mixed in. whereas here it's predominantly flakes and pottery. We haven't dug enough testing to see things like fire pits, burials, use areas. But at this point, it doesn't sound like the tribe would really support that much testing because there's really no reason to justify it. Now, if there was a condo coming here, which there isn't, thank goodness, but if there was a condo that was going to tear down the building and put a gigantic building there, then the tribe would want potentially to do more archaeology to find out how significant the site is and maybe use that to say, you got to leave this here and leave it intact. But now we know there's a site there and we got to figure out what its name is going to be with the tribe. Yeah. Sure.
Can you repeat them back?
Sure, yeah.
There's a question about, do you know if he was sold by his mother or her former owner?
So the question was Dick sold by his mother, Bina, or by the former owner? Bina had no rights, so it would have been sold by her enslaver, whose name was John Morey. Thank you. Hi.
You mentioned the native community. What community that would be?
Sure. So the native community, so I got corrected a couple weeks ago. I'm not supposed to say community. It's native people or native nation. So I'm going to try to do that myself. Sorry. So the native nation that we're talking about is the Massachusetts tribe of Ponkapog. So the Massachusetts tribe of Ponkapog were originally the Neponset band of the Massachusetts at the Neponset area near Lower Mills, the chocolate factory, that kind of thing. During King Philip's War, they got removed to a praying Indian town of Ponkapog, and the descendants of those people from Ponkapog are the Massachusetts of Ponkapog today. And there was a record that was taken in the late 1800s of all the native people of Massachusetts. And the way the Massachusetts defines their eligibility to be a Massachusetts tribal member is if you can tie your ancestry to someone on that list of folks that were registered as Ponkapog people in the 1800s. And it's similar to most other tribes in Massachusetts that it's called the, oh gosh.
That would be
The Earl Report, thank you. The Earl Report is one of the key founding documents for most of the native communities because that was native peoples, because that was the kind of official document that recorded people by their tribe. And so everyone's really using that document to tie ancestry to that.
So who you talk to?
I'm usually talking to Elizabeth Solomon, who's one of the elders of the tribe. She does a lot of work. she did anthropology and archaeology as a younger person. And so she kind of knows the lingo. And so oftentimes when I'm dealing with archaeological sites, I'm working with Elizabeth and another person in the tribe, which is named Ferris Gray, who's a Sagamore of the tribe, which is the number 2 in the tribe, or their war chief. He's really more the land chief now. He and I often do projects where we're actually going to places to look at different deposits and places. But Elizabeth is really kind of like the reviewer of known sites and data that's coming out of the sites. Yeah. And she will say some things to a point, but ultimately the decisions that are being made are made by tribal council and the community as a whole. So she'll have some kind of feedback and discussion, but oftentimes our conversations get to a point where she's like, I need to take this to the tribe and then come back with a final answer because it is a communal decision. Yeah.
And then the other side, what would be the member of the slave community?
That's a much harder thing to do because we don't have a really strong we don't have a really strong documented descendant community. It's happening, but it's an ongoing process. And many of the people that are in Boston today from the Black community are folks that are some people are from Boston from many, many centuries ago. Some people have moved to Boston. So what we're really doing is we're approaching descendant communities more holistically. So what we are doing for our Faneuil Hall exhibit, which we're coming out this summer, and the slave exhibit in Faneuil Hall, we're reaching out to community members in Roxbury, Mattapan, and Dorchester. We're also reaching out to cultural institutions within those organizations to ask questions and bring people together to kind of talk about what kinds of stories we should tell. But at the moment, it's a little bit like Cambridge, for instance, is a little bit ahead of us, where they have a lot of descendants already identified from the folks that were enslaved in Tory Row, for instance. But we are in the process of completing an inventory of every named enslaved person in Boston in the 17th and 18th century. That list is over 1,000 people. So if you take 1,000 people and look at descendants, there's a lot of people but many of those people that are named are just named by their age and gender. So it may say a boy or a man, and other people are named by name. So it's a complex issue. So we have to start with the people that we know and then build out to the current people that we know again and connect those dots.
And this is, you do it out of respect or is it law?
We're doing community art. Our goal is it's community archaeology. So we're the technicians that know how to do archaeology.
Yeah.
We want the questions that are being asked that we can answer through archaeology to be asked by the folks that are directly tied to that. So it's more like we have to, this is really trying to figure out, can we even ask a question here? And now we can ask questions about the native and the enslaved community. So then we go back to those communities and say, is this it? Should we stop? Or is there things that you still want to know?
Do they have that power to do that?
We're giving them power. Yeah, because we're going to listen to what they say. Yep.
Ready for another one? from the
Sure.
online? It says, I think you noted that the Loring Greenough House was built at least partially on the foundation of the prior Cheever House. Can you note where that foundation was, if you know?
I don't know, honestly, I only found that out by doing a tour of the house with the staff there and pointing out some of the parts that were older. This question was about understanding the age of the basement deposits inside the house, or not the deposit, the brick area. That would be a really interesting thing to look at further. There's a different types of brick, and the older bricks are really large. And so if we mapped out where the larger 17th century style bricks were, that could potentially map out a footprint of the original house. They could have just reused old bricks too. Although I wouldn't reuse bricks from a basement floor because they get yeah. So they probably were already there. There's a question in the back, yeah.
Realizing that you have to be experts in the field of agronomy as well. Could you talk a little bit about how you identify that the soil has been brought in as opposed to the soil below it that was local?
Sure. The question was about how do we identify brought in soils versus intact soils. I'm going to try to get back to a photo that has it. Sorry for anybody that doesn't enjoy flashing lights. If you were in Boston on an undeveloped parcel of land, we have soils called entosols. I think that's what they're called. There's a bunch of different soil types, but the ones that we have here follow a really clear pattern. It's a brown soil at the top that we call an A. That's collecting all the organic deposits. And so it's the glacial deposits that are mixed with organic deposits. It's brown. Then the iron from that deposit leaches down into the soils below, and it creates what we call a B soil, which is a reddish color because it's tainted by the iron in the soil. That fades to a slightly lighter brown that we call a B2 soil. And then below that, the original glacial soils that have never seen the light of day since they squirted out of the glacier 20,000 years ago are a kind of olivey gray. So if you look in this image, we have a dark brown, a band of kind of slightly orange soil, and then a little bit lighter. And then like maybe in the last 4 or 5 inches, it's that pretty solid olive color. That is like the poster child for an intact Boston soil. If you look above that, we kind of have what we call a developing A, which is the brown organic rich soils at the top, and then just a mess. So if we were in a part where the soils had been ripped off and all we had left was that subsoil down at the bottom, and then we had an A growing on top of that from historic use over 200 years, we get really confused. And it happens all the time because in Boston, you have a lot of places where the ground has been taken away. So it takes us a while of digging to be like, are we in the subsoil? Because there's nothing here. Are we in a fill where somebody took glacial soils from God knows where and dumped them here for 6 feet and then put some landscaping on top, which we won't know until we find the other A that's down 6 feet? Or are we in an area that had been cut off and we're now kind of just skipping the story and heading right into 20,000? One of the ways we do that is there's iron staining that happens in the glacial deposit. So as we go through that kind of olivey color, you'll see kind of these swirls of rust. That's usually our takeaway that we're in an intact soil. The other thing that happens is it's called a caliche, which is almost like mud that gets stuck to things. So the water table's coming up and hitting rocks. And every time it does that, it deposits just like a little bit of mud onto the bottom of the rocks. So if we're in an intact area with the rocks from the subsoil, when you find the rocks, the part that faces up just looks like a rock. But if you flip it over, it looks like somebody has like smeared spackle on the back of it. So that's another way that we can tell that we're in an intact soil at the bottom. That's only if we're missing the top part, because if we hit an A, it's really nice and clear. In this area, the soils just aren't good enough to be intact soils. That rockiness that you see at the top, that's a mixed in glacial deposit. Oftentimes we have no idea what we're looking at until we get down in our first pit. Then we're like, oh, that makes sense now. So when we're digging, we just call the first color 1, and then strata 2, strata 3, strata 4. And then by the end, we go back and go, okay, strata 4 is the A. Strata 7 is another A. And there's a B soil and there's a fill. And it often can take a really long time before we know kind of what's happening. So in this instance, when we're digging this pit, we thought the top soil was the top of the site. And then we dug down, it just doesn't look right, but like, we don't know what it is. Maybe it's a fill, maybe it's just disturbed. And then all of a sudden those rocky soils just clear away. And it's this beautiful, silty, rock-free, dense, brown, rich brown. And we're like, this is an A, but it could be a redeposited A, which is where somebody dug up that beautiful soil somewhere and dumped it here. So as we go down through, if it starts to transition to that reddish color, then we're like, that A is now in an actual intact B. Now we know that we're in the intact part of the site. And if it goes then into a B2 and a C, then we know we have an intact soil. That site's intact. Does that answer your question, or does that just ask more? Okay. I could talk about soils all day. Now, if you have a question about rocks, we're gonna be here for another 2 hours. Yeah.
So there's somebody asking about the building. Now, if it is a building in the cobbled surface that you found, does that building predate the construction of the L?
Ooh, good question. So the question is, if we found a building next to the cobbled surface ends at the edge of that pit. So it would be something up to the building or whatever it is. We don't know if it's predating or postdating the L. The way we're going to do that is we know the L is 1811. So we're going to look at the stone, and we're going to see what the artifacts above it date to and what the artifacts below it date to. Then we're going to look into the pit that was dug and see what the artifacts in that date to. The youngest artifact in each of those deposits will date the deposit. So we're going to look at that entire feature. We're going to lay it out literally on a table, and we're going to say who's youngest. And then if something from 1890 is there, then we have to go back and say, okay, is this a weirdo, or is this like the actual deposit date? So we're looking at, is it really close to the surface and maybe a rat brought it down or whatever? Or is it something that's like really down in there deep and it's definitely from this deposit? Then we'll use that as a we call it a terminus post quem. So that artifact will date the whole deposit. And so we haven't done that yet. That's the next phase that we're going to be doing to write our report. And so at the end of that, we're going to be able to say, the cistern went in after this date, the pipe went in after this date, this thing went in after this date, the foundations and all this stuff, like everything will have a date associated with it from all the artifacts that we gathered. And then from that, we can start to create the story of the whole space. But it does seem like at the moment, we're missing the 18th century. We have the 17th century in the A and the dirt below it. We have the 19th century on top of it from around the time period of the L, but we don't have a lot of stuff from the 18th century. We have stuff from the 18th century, but it's with the 19th century stuff. So it's all kind of not mixed, but it's sticking around until the 19th century before it's getting thrown out. There is one deposit that has a lot of creamware and not any pearlware. Is that correct?
So yes, it's like there are quite a few creamer shards.
Okay, so that would be potentially Loring's then, because that's post 1762, but no pearlware means pre 1775. On this site, that's Loring. So that could be a Loring related deposit, which means it could be the Othello, Phyllis, and London. Thank you. So those three may be contributing to that deposit, but we have to go through that really, really carefully to see if, because everything's 1760s until one thing is 1820, and then the whole thing becomes 1820.
When do you think you'll be back to dig?
We said in the spring, and to the Loring folks, we're working on it. To be really honest, the issue that's coming up right now is we're working on this big exhibit for Faneuil Hall, which is going to tell the story of Boston slavery. And as you can imagine, that's a really easy, straightforward process. And it's going beautifully smoothly. That is going to really hit a high gear in April and May, because that's when we're going to be finalizing the text and the graphics and everything. And what I'm really nervous about is it's more of my work than I was anticipating. And so I can't be in a hole and responding quickly to design changes at the same time. So we may have to have a conversation. I'm looking at the Loring Greenough folks that I see here about potentially doing work in the fall after the wedding season, unless there's a real need for it in the spring, but we'll talk later. Our people will call your people. And that means that the four of us will call the four of you. Yeah. So, but this year we really want to come back for sure. Yeah. Because we need to finish, and there's some really interesting stuff coming out with the privy, first of all. I mean, come on. And then I think actually I'm a little bit more excited about what's next to the privy. Yeah.
And did any of the previous archaeologists find anything that there was the other digs, anything?
So the collections are predominantly at UMass Amherst, which is a little bit far away, and there's nobody there really able to help us at the moment because they're kind of shutting down their archaeology component, unfortunately. So we haven't been able to really look at that collection, and that's the one closest to where we were digging. The UMass Boston folks were working predominantly in the north yard, and they also found that fill deposit on top of a buried A, but they found a lot less in the A because they were essentially in like the show yard of the property. So there is stuff. We just haven't been able to really examine it in detail. But we are it seems like we're finding more stuff than they were finding, which isn't too surprising because of where we're digging. But the UMass Boston was really looking at the gardens, the current gardens, like the rose, or whatever, is it a rose? The alley down the north yard, to figure out if it's safe basically to be planting there all the time, or is there something really significant there? And they found that it was on top of that fill that we found, which, by the way, this is great. This is really good news. Like, you could do a lot in those upper 3 feet and not disturb the original landscape. But if the 19th century deposits end up being really significant, that's in that upper 3 feet. So it depends on what you are and what story is the real significant story. Bill can be a wonderful thing on an archaeological site because it's just like, have fun in the upper 3 feet. Call me when you get down beyond that. Yeah.
And how do you make the hole?
A shovel.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
We dig square holes with ground
This
shovels.
is a lot of
Yeah.
work.
It is a lot of work, and I do very little of it. So these three here, or at least two here, a lot of volunteers. If you have volunteered on this dig, can you just raise your hand real fast so we can just like appreciate you for a moment? Yeah. Yeah. You all did the lion's share of the work out here. We were scratching our heads, but you all dug the holes and helped screen and found all the artifacts, and hopefully had some fun. Yeah. Yeah. We'll take one more question because I have to go home too. Okay.
There are some of us here from Loring Greenough who helped steward and we're just so grateful for all of your help and your guidance and your knowledge and your questions and what's coming up. And we want to tell all of the stories, and we invite everybody here. If you are interested, please come over to the house, or if you want to get more involved as well, we would welcome anybody to come help us tell their stories.
And thank you for being such wonderful partners on this project. It's been really a joy to work with you all. Yeah.
And we're looking forward to the pretty.
We are too. We are too. Fresh privy. What's the name of the last screener that was there? What was her name?
Danny, what was the last one? You know?
Who was born there? Anna Greenough.
Anna. Hannah or Anna?
Anna.
Anna. Okay. Yeah, so we might find her final deposits. Yeah. Yeah. All right, on that note, thank you all so much. Have a good day.
There you go, and
Thank you, my friend. I'm sorry about the questions. I'm from Peru.